Today we'll be starting chapter 3, long chapter. So what I did was I broke it up into part A and part B. So we're going to treat it as if it was two separate chapters, and every part will have its own programming assignment at the end. So the first part of chapter 3 talks about making decisions in the code. So we're going to talk about control in the code. We're going to talk about the if statement and the switch statement. These are the parts of the chapter that we will be discussing. Notice that there are some topics that I am skipping. So like, for example, the first part 2.1, 2.2, I'm skipping 2.4. So these are the sections from the book that I will be talking about. Okay. Now, when we wrote code before, we basically wrote code that was sequential. You know, we wrote a sequence of steps to be done, and we expected the JVM to execute everything that we were doing. Sometimes you want to write code that gets executed if something is true and doesn't get executed if that thing is false. So for example, you know, I might want to check someone's grade, and if their grade is less than a C, I'll say, okay, you know, you need to go do some tutoring. If it's not less than C, then I'm just going to skip over that. And that's what we do. That's what we use an if statement for. The way we use an if statement is we if, and in parentheses, we're going to write some expression that has to evaluate to true or false. And if that expression evaluates to true, we're going to do what's underneath the if statement. If you have more than one thing you want to do, then you would put curly braces around these statements. Okay? So the first thing is, how do we write these Boolean expressions? So to write these Boolean expressions, we're going to rely on some relational operators. Basically, we want to check if something is bigger than something else, less than, equal, not equal. So we're going to use the relational operators greater than, less than, greater than or equal, less than or equal. Equal means is it equal? It's asking if they're equal. And exclamation mark equal means not equal. So it's going to test if they're equal or not equal. And if you ask, you know, for example, is 5 greater than 2? If the answer is yes. So yes means true. So that would be something that gives me back a true or false. And remember, we said true or false is a Boolean. It was one of the primitive data types that we learned before. So here are some examples. So if I want to check someone's grade, here I'm assuming that there's a variable called grade, and I'm asking if the value that's stored in that variable is greater than or equal to 90, I'm going to tell them they got an A. I could also have a variable that is a char. So here, since I'm comparing this attendance variable to the letter A, that means it's a character, it's a char variable. And equal is asking if they're equal. I could also say if they're not equal. So here, if their attendance is not equal to A, I will say you are in class today, keep up the good work. So here, because I want to do more than one thing, I put them in between the greater than and less than sign. Let's look at an example here. This is a program. It is creating some variables. So it created 4 doubles. It created a scanner to read in from system.in. And then it went and it read in the 3 variables the user typed in. So it read in the first number, it read in the second number, it read in the third number. It's doing a calculation to find the average of those 3 numbers. So it adds the 3 scores. Notice that we have parentheses around the adding because we want to do all the adding before we divide. And then we calculate the average. We display the average to the user. And then we want to check if their average is greater than 95, we're going to say this is a nice score. So this is an example of how we could use it. Okay, notice that at the end of the if statement, there is no semicolon. So remember we said in Java, every statement ends with a semicolon. So I say int x equal to semicolon, system.out.println something, semicolon. This if statement here, we don't put a semicolon after the parenthesis. Why? Because we are just starting the expression. We are just saying, if this is true, go ahead and do this thing that's underneath. So it's kind of equivalent to writing it all on one line like this with a semicolon at the end. Okay. If you forget to put curly braces around the statements that you want to execute, only one statement will get executed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here and I'm going to go show you some examples in NetBeans before we continue. So let's import our scanner so we can ask the user for information. So import java.util.scanner. And if you're watching this, I expect that you have your IDE open, your NetBeans open, and you are typing with me to try this out yourself. So let's create our scanner. So we're going to say scanner keyboard equal to new scanner system.in. And the more you write this line of code, the faster you're going to memorize it. And then let's ask the user for some stuff. So let's ask them system.out.println, enter the numerator. So let's ask them for the numerator and let's read it in. So let's say int n equal to keyboard. And because it's an int, I'm going to use the next int method. And then I'm going to ask them for the denominator. So let's do that. System.out.println, enter denominator. And remember, when you have a fraction, the top number is called numerator and the bottom number is called denominator. So this is what we're doing. We're asking for the top number in a fraction and the lower number in the fraction. So both of them are ins. So I read them in. So this is the first part, asking for the numerator. And then I ask for the denominator. And then what I want to do is I want to print out n divided by d. I want to print out the value that it is. But let's try this out. So first, let's fix some things that we talked about before. So if I enter a numerator of 1, a denominator of 2, I expect that I'm going to, why did it say append? I expect to get a half out of it, but I don't. I get a 0. Do you guys remember why? So remember, whole number divided by whole number gives you a whole number back. So I need to use casting. So let's cast it to a float. So I'm going to cast one of them to a float so that it treats one of them as a float so that I get a decimal number out of it. Let's try again. Numerator is 1, denominator is 2. Now I get the answer is 0.5. Great, it's working. Now let's say the user entered for the numerator a 1 and for the denominator a 0. And I get infinity, which is not the correct answer. This code should probably warn the user if they try entering a denominator of 0. So before I display the answer, I should check if the denominator is equal to 0, then, if it's not equal to 0. If it's not equal to 0, then I will display the answer. So I will only display an answer if it's not 0. So let's try again. So if I give it a 1 and a 2, it works. And if I give it a 1 and a 0, nothing gets printed. Okay, so I don't get the infinity. If I wanted to do more than one thing in here, let's actually, let's just, here, do you see here, like when I press enter, so one thing I want to just show you, when I came here after the if and I pressed enter, immediately NetBeans helped me by indenting this line. So it's kind of telling me what you are about to type is going to happen only if this if statement is true. So that's why the cursor shows up here. You know, I can change it and put it wherever I want. So, you know, I can change this and put it here. It'll still behave the same way. So just because the indentation is different doesn't mean it's not going to work. It still gives me the 0.5. It's still detecting that the denominator is not a 0. I could even put it here on, you know, on this line, and it'll still give me the same thing. As long as the denominator is not 0, it's still going to give me an answer. Okay, so putting it underneath like this is just a visual aid for us when we are writing code to see what is it that's going to happen if this if statement is true, if this expression evaluates to true. Now, notice here after the semicolon, if I press enter, immediately it's taking me outside. It's not indenting it. So it's kind of indicating to me that this line of code that you are writing is not associated with the if statement. It will always happen because it's not under statement. So even if I try tabbing it in here, you know, thinking, oh, if I tab it in, it'll only take place if D is not 0. Well, let's put a D of 0. Well, I put a D of 0, so this is false, so it didn't do this part. It didn't do the division and display it, but it still displayed the will always happen. Why? Because it's not really under the if. I indented it manually, but it's not taking effect. The right code should be indented this way. So what if I wanted this to only be underneath the if? Well, if I wanted it to be underneath the if, I have to put curly braces around it. And in this case, if I were to erase that and press enter, you see that it's indented. Okay, so now this line of code will only show up if the denominator is not a 0. If I enter a denominator of a 0, it doesn't show up. Neither of these show up. Why? Because they are wrapped inside these curly braces. So if you want just one line to be executed, then you don't need those curly braces. But if you have more than one statement that you want to happen, then you would have to put them here. So, you know, maybe here I'll say the answer is instead, something like that. So here I'll say the answer is, and then display the answer. So here, if I give a denominator that is not 0, it'll display the answer is and do the 0.5, display the answer for me.